Hey, this is Ed Larson, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
So first off, I've got a new co-host who's never done this before, Eric Hoagland, who's from my hometown, and it's always great to have time with Eric. So thank you very much. I was up in Benicia recently, which used to be the state capital, and we were just talking with Ed off mic about that. And Eric said, "Hey, I read this fascinating book about Lincoln and Washington together, and how they helped form the country and their relationship and all that kind of thing." And I thought, man, that's fascinating. And it's one of those things, Ed, that I've always wondered because they're both such luminaries. We often see them as distinct, but and I'm so glad you told the story. They are much more closely tied. They're among the most successful businessmen of their day, and I guess in particular, also let's also make sure we cover, this deconstruction of who the founders were. I'd like to also get into that, but otherwise, thanks for coming on, and Eric, thanks for hanging out with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And yeah, that's part of what you say is part of the reason why I took this up. I mean, I'm a writer, but I'm also a college professor, and I've taught American history for years. And here are the two real lions of the Revolutionary Age. I mean, any historian you look at today, or even back then, Adams, Jefferson, they all said that Franklin and Washington were up here, way up high, and everybody else was at lower level. And I think that's true. They're the two indispensable men to make the indispensable people to make the revolution work. And so they had to work together, but nobody writes about them because we do think about them differently. One was a northerner, the other was a southerner. One was a printer, the other was a planter. One we associate with military, and the other we associate with invention and diplomacy. So we think of them as different, but they had to work together or the whole thing wouldn't have worked. They worked together in the Revolution, we know, in some way. They worked together at the Constitutional Convention. And so what I thought I'd do is look at how they did work together. In a way, it was sort of leadership studies. How did these guys make this work? Because it was a long shot. No colony had ever broken away from its founding country before, and they did it. And so I went back and sort of studied their relationship, all their letters, and I found out the relationship actually went way back to the French and Indian War, when they both led the military for their respective states, which were then neighboring states, fighting a common enemy, the French and the Native Americans in alliance with some other Native American tribes. And so we could see how they worked together then, really very closely, how they built up a relationship, how they stayed in contact. And when the Second Continental Congress comes, they were the two superstars. They were already the two superstars. They were the ones greeted. And they were two early and strong advocates of revolution and independence, and how they worked together. And then, of course, they come together again for the Constitutional Convention. And when Washington goes up to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, the first place he goes was to Ben Franklin's house. When he arrives, he goes straight there to conference. So it's a long story together, and it's sort of fun to watch two very different people working together.
Yeah, the one of the things I've always wondered was who got it into George's head, and maybe George came up with himself, but to start wearing his uniform, like just to assume that you were going to be the commander of the armies, and I've always wondered if that wasn't a little bit of Ben Franklin's brilliance to say, just start showing up in your uniform, you're going to be the general. Any thoughts on that at all?
Well, certainly Ben Franklin wanted him to be the leader. He proposed him to be the head of the military. They'd worked together, as I said, way back in the French and Indian War. Franklin understood Washington's character, and he proposed him for the job of taking over the Continental troops. Actually, if you believe Washington, he came up wearing the uniform because he was already serving. He had been asked, the counties in Virginia had militarized in response to the Stamp Act, and then getting worse and worse and worse. And they had formed their own militias. And several of these counties, because Washington was the war hero, the local war hero from the French and Indian War, several of these counties had asked Washington to be their head of their county militia, including Fairfax County. And so what he was technically doing was wearing his uniform as head of the Fairfax County militia. He was a few other counties. And therefore, that was his role. He had actually picked up all the uniform and everything, or the equipment that was turned into his uniform, when he'd been at Philadelphia a year before for the First Continental Congress, when Franklin wasn't there. Now, the reason why I figure Washington probably picked this up on his own was, while Franklin overall was such a uncommon genius and had a great sense of, what to wear and how to dress and how to talk to be effective wherever he was, whether he was in Quaker Philadelphia or in the court of the French king. Washington also was a tremendous stage actor because he wasn't much of a speaker. Franklin really wasn't much of a speaker either. What Washington had mastered was the art of display. In fact, John Adams, who was always jealous of everyone, once said that Washington was the greatest political actor he'd ever seen. And so he knew how to put on airs. He was a big, tall man, and he knew how to put on a show. He loved plays, and so everything he did physically was an act, that he thought out, including his most famous scenes like his resignation or his great talk when he put on his glasses in front of his troops. He was an actor, and he knew just the pose to take. He was like Ronald Reagan was. He was perfect. And so I figure he picked it up on his own because he was an instinctive public performer. Franklin was too, of a very different sort, because Washington put on the airs of Virginia gentry, while Franklin put on the airs of, as he'd call it, a middling or a middle class, even though he was incredibly wealthy, this sort of middle class Pennsylvania quasi-secular Quaker. They all had their acts, and they worked really well. It's part of what made them great leaders.
Yeah, I think that was a kind of an interesting part of the book where you put in where he's sitting in the salons of France and he's wearing beaver hat and he's playing the frontiersman to the T to entertain and keep those folks interested in the American dream.
And he never would have dressed like that in Philadelphia. This was a act, and it worked beautifully. He kept getting money. He bankrupted France to support us.
I love it. So when we see like their collaboration, talk about the French and Indian War. Did they run across each other? Did they have kind of interaction? Was it love at first sight for these guys? What was it like early on?
They did run across each other because what happened was, at that time, the French and Indian War, which becomes the 7 Years' War worldwide, the first really global war between the global empires of France and England, started in what was then called the Ohio country. Really, we're talking about the area around Pittsburgh, western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, West Virginia, because those areas were claimed by both Britain and not before, but beginning about this time in the 1750s by France. France by this time has settled Louisiana, and as well as they've settled Quebec, and and their connection had been all the way up the Great Lakes and around through what's now Chicago and down the Mississippi, and they decided to cut across there and use the Ohio Valley. So that way they would go straight from the Niagara region straight down to what's now St. Louis, or was then their fort of St. Louis, and then on down to the Mississippi. And so they moved into that area building forts. Well, the British had claimed that since colonial times. And it's interesting because Pennsylvania claimed it going west. If you think of just taking the two lines of Pennsylvania and go west, Virginia claimed the same territory because they claimed, we know their southern border, it's where it is now with Carolina, but the northern border was the Potomac River. So if you follow the Potomac River, which when they wrote the charter didn't know it went north, but it goes northwest. And so it cups up. And so both of them claimed the area around Pittsburgh, and they both were projecting settlers back there. And now France is too, and France builds a fort right at the forks of the Ohio. They tear down the Virginia fort there and put up their own fort, or Virginia was trying to build one. Now that brings them in contact because of his brother's death, Lawrence, and the death, he has moved up, and because of another fortuitous death, fortuitous for Washington, not for the dead man, Washington becomes head of the Virginia militia for this time. At the same time, when the war starts, the Quakers that are running Pennsylvania drop out of the legislature because they can't fight, and they need to. There's slaughter, there's massacres going on the frontier, and these Pennsylvania settlers, the ones that survive, are flooding into Philadelphia. So when the Quakers leave, the other party, the secular party, basically takes over. Well, Franklin's the head of the secular party. He's in the state legislature. So he's assigned the task of creating a militia. Turns out he's very clever at that as well as anything he does. Okay. So he's the colonel in charge of the Pennsylvania militia and designing and figuring out where to build forts to protect the frontier. Meanwhile, and at that time, the two colonies, because Maryland ends, because they're both claiming the Ohio country, they're overlapping. They have overlapping jurisdiction. So he starts meeting with Washington, who's head of the Virginia militia, because those militias have to work together. Now, where they really get to know each other was when General Braddock comes over. The British, when they see the trouble, they send an army over, a real British army, not a militia army, a state militia army or a colonial militia army, with orders to march west and reclaim the forks of the Ohio, what's now Pittsburgh, and take out Fort Duquesne. Well, Franklin urges him to go through Pennsylvania, figuring it's an easier route. Washington claims, no, go up the Potomac. Of course, they each want to promote their own state. But both of them, but then he says he's going to march through the wilderness with this redcoat army. And both Washington and Franklin say, don't do it. You'll be sliced to pieces by the Native Americans and French because they'll be shooting from the woods. And he looks at them and says, no, they may scare and defeat your local colonial militia, but they won't defeat a British army. Well, they sliced him to pieces, exactly what Franklin and Washington warned him against. But it was Franklin provided the wagons and the horses, and Washington went with him. He didn't have an official commission, but he went with him, hemorrhoids and all, riding on a cushion on top of his saddle, and what they end up doing is Washington ends up picking up the injured, dying Braddock and carries him back, and then when he dies, buries him at Fort Necessity under the road, because of course the natives are coming in and the French are coming in and scalping everyone and taking trophies, and he buries them under the road, on which then he orders Franklin's wagons to keep running over so it becomes invisible. In fact, it was so invisible that they only found the body a few years ago. Wow. So they went back and they worked together for the same end. And when later, indeed, both of them become strong advocates of intercolonial union at this time. This is a lasting effect of this war. They both learned the exact same lessons, because they write about them, the exact same lessons. First, they learned from the French and Indian War that the colonies have to work together. The way they finally captured Fort Duquesne, they didn't even use British troops. It was a collection of the colonies working together with their militia that finally takes back what's now Pittsburgh. So they knew they had to have union. And indeed, the first political cartoon ever drawn in America is a cartoon by Benjamin Franklin in his newspaper of the colonies of a rattlesnake, the famous picture of the rattlesnake, where it's unite or die, cut into pieces with each piece being a different colony. But if you actually look at the cartoon in context, what's written around that is Washington's letter report describing what was happening there. So Franklin places this in the middle of an article by Washington in his newspaper. So they learned they had to unify. They learned that the British could not be trusted because the British get them to do all the fighting and do all the dying. And then when the war is over, they make the proclamation of 1763, barring the settlers, Pennsylvania and Virginia, from settling the forks of the Ohio or anywhere west. And they imposed the Stamp Act and other taxes on the colonies to pay for a war that the colonies had fought themselves and died for. And third, they learned from Braddock's defeat that, yeah, the British might be tough in Europe, but they could be beat in frontier fighting. So they learned the three key lessons: that the British can't be trusted, that the colonies have to be unified into one union, and that the British can be beat. So they both carried the same lessons out of the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War really shaped the way they thought, and of course gave Franklin didn't want to be head of the military. I mean, that's the last thing he wanted to do. And he made him realize that Washington was the man to do that. And Washington learned that Franklin had a silver tongue. I mean, he could, he could talk anybody out of anything, and so he was a perfect diplomat.
So, what do you think at the time of the first Continental Congress, when they were sitting together and they had the representatives from each place, and at that time, Washington's like, I got to get out of here. There's fighting to be done back here, and Franklin's holding him back because he knows he has a weak group of men. In his eyes, they're sort of a weak group of men. How do you think Benjamin Franklin handled that? Because Washington eventually leaves, and he has to pick a successor in that group of men. So where does Franklin come in? Do they talk about that? Do they say this is our guy Hancock, or is this our? Do they come together on that, or is that all Franklin?
No, I mean, they worked together. There were some other early advocates of revolution. John Adams and Samuel Adams were early advocates of independency, as they'd call it back then. The Lees of Virginia were early advocates of independency. Washington was, certainly, Franklin was, but Hancock was as well. And so Franklin's gift is getting people together. He never likes to be up front. And one thing about Washington and Franklin that's a character of leadership is they both made friends. They both liked to work somewhat behind the scenes. They were both compromisers on means to get their ultimate goals. And so they'd rather let somebody like Hancock, to be up front. So Franklin knew he had a team together, and he knew and how he'd work together. He knew he had basically the Massachusetts-Virginia coalition. And if Washington wasn't there, well, Washington's not going to be the sort of person like Richard Henry Lee, who always puts himself forward. And when he gets Jefferson in there as a replacement, Jefferson's strong for independence too. And so he knew he had the team, and Franklin was sort of sitting in the middle. Pennsylvania was one of the questionable delegations, so you couldn't lose him, or you wouldn't have any supporter in Pennsylvania, because they were a bunch of Quakers and they were a bunch of compromisers on the whole idea of independence. And so you need Franklin anchoring because the three big states then, we don't think of them that way now, but population-wise, the three and money-wise, the three dominant states then were Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia. Everything else was a lot smaller. New York was still a much smaller state. So you had to keep those three in play. So, and sending sending Washington up helped steal Massachusetts because you're bringing Virginia into play up there. But Franklin takes over as head of the war councils. And so he's head of the committees dealing with war. So he's going up and meeting with Washington up in Cambridge and in Connecticut. And of course, as he's going, he's already got an honorary degree from Harvard, an honorary degree from Yale. I mean, he's known in these places. And so he's meeting with Washington on a regular basis, sort of plotting the war. He of course meets with the Peace Commission from the British up in Staten Island, and so he goes up when Washington's troops invade Canada. Franklin goes with them. At his age, I mean, he's already 70, traipses up into Montreal to try to keep the French and to keep the war front going there. So Franklin's traveling a lot, and Washington, of course, is coming back to Philadelphia, and Washington comes back for the when Virginia brings in its resolution for independency, which was Franklin's idea. When Richard Henry Lee gets Virginia to propose independence because they thought it would be better coming from Virginia than Massachusetts. Adams would have proposed it. But Adams is backbiting against Washington by this time. Franklin's keeping them all together. Washington comes down from the front to back that up. And then, of course, Franklin is put on the committee to write the Declaration of Independence and ends up making the key changes that we all know and love today. So they're really working together at every stage through that. And Washington has his own clout because he's sending messages back every day. So I don't think it really loses. You didn't really lose Washington's clout. Indeed, if anything, he gains clout because then when he liberates Boston, well, he's a hero again.
Man, this is interesting. Okay, so I want to ask a question to give us some context of the time. If I remember correctly, the population of Georgia is like less than 3,000 people at the time. Is that right? And then how the heck does Georgia even get part of this thing? Like, it just seems so impossible to be that far away and that small. And then why not Florida? Why not bring them in? Because I think they were moving away from the Spanish at the time. Help us understand that context.
Yes, Georgia, Spain, Florida wasn't. Florida had been Spanish. It sort of goes back and forth between Spain and England, and so it was not an English colony. The more likely, the one they tried to get to join was not Florida, but the Bahamas, and they would send troops down to the Bahamas, and they tried to get Bahamas. Of course, they tried to get Canada to join as well. Georgia was an official colony by then. It had been created as a debtor's prison, a reformatory for debtors, and then it had been flipped over and became a secular colony. It was still quite small, but it had been created both as a debtor's colony as a buffer between Spanish Florida and the still somewhat small but successful colony of South Carolina because of the planter population there. Georgia had been moving west. Of course, it's on the retreat after the revolution begins because the Native Americans, the Cherokee and the Cree were quite strong and ended up pushing back and reclaiming 2/3 of Georgia by the time of the Constitutional Convention. And were pushed back. The Georgians were pushed back towards Savannah, but it was small. But it was committed, and so it sent delegations up. The one thing nice about the Georgia delegations is they actually chose some very able people like Abraham Baldwin, and they had a lot of independence because it was very hard. You couldn't communicate between Savannah and Philadelphia. The communications were almost nil. You couldn't travel overland. You had to go by boat, and boats just didn't go that way. In the colonial period, it's hard to think, but there was so little contact between the colonies were regional. So sure, the middle colonies, Virginia and Maryland, would communicate, and the New England colonies. But if you wanted to send a letter from Boston to South Carolina or to Virginia, the easiest way to send it in colonial times was to London and then back, because you didn't have trade up and down the colonies. You did have trade from the colonies down to the Caribbean colonies because they were carrying food back and forth. And sugar and molasses up. There was that sort of communication, but not between the colonies very much. And so Georgia was fairly isolated, and the news traveled very, very slowly. So when they did send a delegate up, like Abraham Baldwin, who had, I think he'd gone to Yale, he'd gone to school somewhere up in the Northeast, and he was from the Northeast and had moved down there. They sent him back, and he basically could do what he wanted to. And Franklin works his wonders on Baldwin. In fact, Baldwin, this is part of the tie, Baldwin goes back to Georgia after the war. And the first thing Georgia does is tries to create a college, a state college, because they didn't have any colleges down there. And once it's an independent state, it needs a college. So the first state chartered state university is what's now known as University of Georgia. But that's not what was named then. It's Franklin College. And in fact, still the undergraduate school of the University of Georgia is Franklin College, named by Baldwin for Benjamin Franklin. So the ties, you can see he had a close tie. The one person he most wanted to meet was Franklin, and Franklin could pretty well control his vote.
That's fascinating. I love it. Another thing I wanted to ask is we're often hard on ourselves and hard on the founders these days with things that we're able to get done. But I look back at just how hard it was to get these independent colonies to become one thing, and how many times ratification for something came down to one vote or someone simply not showing up to vote. Without Franklin and Washington, would this be a nation, do you think? Would they have figured it out some other way? I mean, you've got to have these leaders to get to the next layer of founders who are brilliant.
I agree with that. Okay. Most historians would say the same thing, but even back then, Jefferson explained, Franklin didn't, he said to Washington, Franklin and you're in a class by yourself. John Adams, who always put a sour tone on everything, said, when this is all over, all the American people will remember that Ben Franklin threw down a lightning bolt, up popped George Washington, and we had independence. We'll all be forgotten. And of course, that's not true. We still remember the Jeffersons and the Adams, and we should remember Nathaniel Greene, the great military leader, Horatio Gates, a sort of off again, on again military leader, John Hancock, of course, who was central to both the ratification of the Constitution and a great leader of the Second Continental Congress, and others. There were others, but Franklin and Washington were in a class by themselves. It's hard to imagine eventually the colonies in England were just growing so distinct. And that's one thing. Both Franklin and Washington were reluctant revolutionaries. They became committed early revolutionaries for independence, but they both had been successful before. They weren't like Tom Paine, who doesn't really have a history before the Revolution, or even Jefferson for that matter. They had who inherited, or Madison who inherited. Both Franklin and Washington didn't. Franklin started as an indentured servant. He fled being an indentured servant in Boston. That's why he always hated slavery, and becomes an early abolitionist, because he remembered being a slave, as it were, indentured servant, a form of slavery, certainly not as bad as chattel slavery in the South, but not much different than the type of slavery that was practiced in the northern colonies. And Washington, of course, never knew he'd inherit his father's property because he was the third son. He thought he had to make his own way, so he was a frontier, developed skills as a frontier surveyor and investing on the frontier. And so they both have made their way in colonial times, but they both converted over to realize that the British would never treat the Americans as equals. And that's what Franklin always pleaded for. Just give us seats in the parliament. This will be great. We'll be the greatest country in the world. But England wanted to run things by itself, and they realized as long as we're second-class citizens and as we get wealthier, we'll just be taxed more and won't have any control over it. So taxation without representation was a key issue for Washington. For Franklin, it was more the taking away of rights like rights onto the frontier, and just the way the British lorded it over the Americans. So those ideas grew in both those people. So if you didn't have people of this stature who had made it before, so it wasn't like France, which was more of a lower class revolution of people who had been sorely oppressed rising up, or you think of the Bolshevik Revolution. Here was a middle class revolution in the sense that these are people who had been successful, who were fighting to more preserve their rights than to acquire their rights. And so it gave a tone to the American Revolution, which was fundamentally different than the French or the Haitian or the Russian or the Chinese Revolution. And that's, part of the reason why the revolution worked in the way it did. But another reason why, when people look back, they look at some of these leaders and say, well, they didn't fight for me. They fought for preserving rather than expanding rights. And so you do get that. It depends on which revolutionary you're working with. That doesn't work for Thomas Paine. It doesn't work for certainly many of them. And in fact, it only works partly for Franklin, but it makes our revolution really different in many ways than other revolutions that followed it.
Isn't that interesting that the correlation today with these venerated forefathers that we had before? I mean, we do look at them as and rightfully so, as being great men that really changed the world. But yet at the same time, you've got Washington saying, hey, these guys in Congress won't even pay my soldiers. They can't pass anything. They can't get anything done. Well, that echoes today so prevalently. They can't get anything done. And so when you see that, maybe you could speak a little bit to the fact that this wasn't a perfect unit. It was a more perfect unit. They were working towards something,
Well, that's certainly true. And whenever you're looking at any of these people, it's always hard to make anybody an unadulterated hero because we're all human.
Yeah.
We all are. I mean, whether you look at the Bible or evolutionary biology, we're all fallen angels. We're fallen people. We've got our flaws. And no one's really should be our heroes other than our parents. Everyone else, if you look close enough, you can find things that are far from perfect about any of these people. Now, some of them are worse than others. That's for sure. But you look at these people in context, and whatever you're absolutely right. Washington was furious with Congress for not even paying his troops. Those troops fought for years without any pay at all. They were lucky to get food. And Franklin was just as frustrated because he had to keep begging for money from the French, or basically he wouldn't beg, he would sort of connive and weasel it out of them because he was very clever at that, getting the French to do which in the long term was not in the King of France's best interest, fomenting a popular revolution. He soon lost his head on all that. But Franklin was just as frustrated. Here was a country, here was a Congress that had law, and you can read their letters, that initially the Congress had really fine people like the Adamses and the Lees and the Hancocks and the Franklins and the Washingtons, and gradually they all leave and are replaced by these second-rate people who and the letters between Washington and Franklin complaining about Congress, they were equally frustrated by this group in Congress. So and so were others. So were people like the rising young people, like Madison and Hamilton, who were in that next generation, who served as aides to these people, largely often to Washington, and they would feel it even more. And that is, that's something that sticks with us. But they both had this fear that what's even worse than an inept Congress is a bad leader. Because if you put somebody like a King George over top of them, and they'd look around and they'd see bad governors like Patrick Henry in Virginia, who you couldn't trust at all. And then they'd look at somebody like a Hancock, who was in some ways so able and so talented, but also pretty vain. Then they'd see a George Clinton in New York. And you could look around and you could see the dangers of a demagogue so easy in this world. And that's why Franklin, who by the end of the Constitutional Convention was very fearful that they'd created a way too strong presidency. But he said, I'm supporting this, when everyone else who was with him, all the others bolted, like Randolph and Mason and Jury in Massachusetts. They bolted and voted against it because of the too strong presidency. Franklin said, I trust Washington in this job. And even though we've created a presidency that's way too strong, it's a vehicle. He called it a fetus of monarchy. I trust Washington in it. Washington's going to do a great job. And as long as somebody with Republican virtue like Washington is president, this thing's going to work. And so he ended up backing it because of Washington, then becomes an early advocate of Washington being president. The only other viable alternative that people saw was Franklin, but Franklin knew he was too old to take the job. And anybody close to him knew he was too old to take the job. He was 81 by this time, which back then was pretty old. He makes Joe Biden look young. And he was also infirm, but he was sharp as a tack to the end. And he knew, so as long as Washington, he trusted it would work. But he was afraid, as was Washington, that if you put somebody like a Patrick Henry in here, or they soon learned an Aaron Burr, even Hamilton, who hated Jefferson, said, well, Jefferson at least is an honorable man. We can't trust Aaron Burr with this much power. And so they knew they knew each other, and they deeply believed that that Republican virtue was necessary in our leaders. Congress, you didn't have the same worries about Congress. The worries about Congress is they'd end up just squabbling and getting nothing done. The fear of the presidency is it wouldn't squabble and it would get too much done.
What would they say about the presidency now with the executive orders and look, just across all lines, like Bill Clinton indefinitely deploying people to Bosnia, signing a 30-year lease the minute we get there. I mean, like these guys, there's so much Polk taking over like half of the country. Jefferson also going out and saying, I'm going to buy all this land, all these presidential power, leaps, Jackson, all that. What would they say now today?
Well, this was a fear that Franklin very clearly articulated, as did Governor Randolph of Virginia, who had originally offered the Virginia plan, and George Mason, who was always suspicious of power. And indeed, if there's anybody who revolutionized George Washington during the Revolution, it's George Mason. He never gets enough of credit for his role of radicalizing Washington in the first place. They would have said, this is the dangers. You give too much power to any one thing, any one place. That's why Hamilton and Madison were such advocates of a balance of power and of giving power to different branches. They would have expected this is what might happen. This is the grave dangers. We have to remember that when the Virginia plan was offered, the original Virginia plan, as drafted by the Virginia delegations and Pennsylvania delegations jointly. So Washington was there, Franklin was there, Madison certainly had a large role in this, Randolph, Wilson, these other people, Morris. They called for the president, or they didn't have a name for the president, but the chief executive, to be chosen by Congress. So it would have been much more close to the parliamentary democracies that we see in Europe. And those tend to work better on that respect, in the sense that while you can look at the United States, as the first modern democracy, what other democracies did you have before it? Switzerland, but we're talking about small cantons there. The first modern democracy, and we became a model, a city on a hill for others to follow, but they didn't follow our presidency. The only places you have a presidency like ours are authoritarian countries like Russia, or now Turkey, or now Egypt, as they've changed it. France in a way, but France is only part way. It's only in foreign policy that the president has such powers as our president, and that was only because de Gaulle insisted on it. Most of them whether it be Japan and in the democracy created by MacArthur there, or England or France or the Scandinavian countries or Italy, they have parliamentary democracies. And that was the original idea that we'd have. And then when, for a variety of reasons, they turned away from that and went instead to have a separately chosen president, largely opposed by Franklin, the ideas of checks and balances. But then Franklin pushes, well, we don't want to have an electoral college. We want to have popular election of the presidency. Franklin and others, Morris, back that. And it's only the southern states that flip it to a electoral college. But all those things, they ended up creating a much more powerful presidency than had been originally envisioned in the Virginia plan. And Franklin always believed that we should have stuck with the original plan and was concerned. That's when he starts using the phrases at the Constitutional Convention, joined by Randolph, the person who offered the Virginia plan. This is a fetus for monarchy. That was a term that 4 people used, and 3 of those 4 end up voting against the Constitutional Convention, mainly on that grounds, but also on the fact that there wasn't a Bill of Rights.
I want to ask you too. I'm going to jump in on Eric. Sorry. You know what, Eric? You asked your question. I'll come back to mine. Go ahead.
Well, just kind of leading to that is just to finish up to that point is that, there was a plan there that there would be a triumvirate. There would be a presidency of 3. And there was some real backing for it. However, the understanding was if that happens, Washington is out. He would never answer to another partnership in that role. And do you think that was the true ending of that, or maybe that triumvirate was the beginning of the separate, or the more solidifying of the separation of powers through the Congress, the judicial, and the executive?
Well, the triumvirate was an interesting idea. It was when the original idea, of course, was to have the president be chosen by Congress. And so you'll have some sort of a parliamentary democracy idea. And then when that clearly wasn't going to work, it did stay to the very end. The convention starts in May. It's proposed at the beginning of June, and all the way to September, that's remains. But it keeps a majority till then, but it's always shaky. And so they begin experimenting. The Constitutional Convention, people don't think of it this way, but if you tried to break down the time spent on every issue in the Constitutional Convention, the one they spend more time on than any other single issue by far is the executive. They pretty well figure out the others. And the big issues that are dividing it is slavery. They spend a lot of time on slavery, and the presidency. Those are and then don't spend as much time, but the other big issue is how to divide up power in the Senate, which ends up leading to the so-called Great Compromise that gives the all states 2 seats, rather than the original plan, which was proportional representation in the Senate as well as the House. So those are the 3 big issues of contention. And the presidency is the toughest one. And so one of the ideas floated was a triumvirate, and they get the idea from 2 places. One place was they're looking for antecedents to a leader who is not either takes power by military, like the old Roman emperors, or who is hereditary, like the French or the English or typical kings. And they have a few places where they have elected leaders, and they look to those. And one is the Pope is elected by the cardinals, which is eventually the idea we have with electors replacing cardinals. The Doge in Venice, because Venice that time was a great empire, and they had an elected Doge who would basically serve, I think, for life after they were elected. You had the King of Poland, who's elected, and that's about it. Besides these little cantons, but if you look back to old Republic in Rome, and they're doing everything. In ancient Republic in Rome, they had a triumvirate to break up power. The Senate didn't want the executive too powerful, so Rome had a triumvirate, and so they looked to that. And then some of the regions who are at the Constitutional Convention, yeah, that's a good idea because we have three regions. We have the Northeast, or which we now know as New England. You have the Middle States, and you have the Southern states, and they're very different. The Southern have chattel slavery and plantations. The Northeast is mostly trading, and the Middle states are commercial agriculture, in the sense of growing foodstuffs and cattle and things like that. So they're very different, and some industry. And so you have the three regions. Triumvirate works perfect. We'll have one leader from each, and then they'll have to agree 2 out of 3. And if you have 2 of the regions, well, then we can go forward. So to some people, this seemed like a good idea. But as you point out, Washington was never the sort of person. Washington loved to take counsel. He was a president much as he'd been a general. He knew he wasn't brilliant. What he was wise. That's very different than brilliant. Franklin was an idea person, so was Hamilton, so was Madison. Washington was good at hearing others out and then figuring the route to go. Before every battle, he'd have a council and he'd listen to all his lieutenants, and then he'd come to make a decision, trying to create a consensus. Franklin was sort of like that as well. He had what he did. Franklin had all the ideas himself, but he'd feed them to other people. So they would come from other people and not sound like his ideas. And then he'd say, oh, that's a good idea. He was very clever at seeding his ideas to other people, which he knew he was doing. But it's just the way he operated. He never wanted to be the point person. He always loved to shift the idea to somebody else, which is a good strategy. Political, as long as you're comfortable in your own skin. And that's one trait. I digress here, but one trait that Washington and Franklin had in common, and I think they recognized it, is both of them, unlike Hamilton or Madison or Hancock, they were comfortable in their own skin. They didn't need anybody to praise them. They knew who they were. They knew their own worth. They were happy to give credit to others. They were happy, nobody could, and that's a real strength they weren't egotistics. They weren't narcissistical. They didn't need praise. That's a real trait if you want to be an effective leader. And they both had it in great excess, and they recognized that in the others. That's why they both so quickly resigned any office they had. And if anybody questioned, it says, well, I'll just quit and you can run the thing. And there's no, you stay. And they knew how to play that card. And so with the triumvirate, Washington could never work with other people. He worked with other people, but in a different sort of way. And so a triumvirate would have been a disaster. He never would have agreed to serve. And Franklin and so many of the others there were convinced the only person that can make this new Constitution work is Washington as president. So they weren't going to create something he didn't like. Now, he would have been fine with a parliamentary democracy. He would have been, because Congress would have picked him, and he would have been like Angela Merkel in Germany, or any of the others, Churchill during the war. I mean, these people, you can take a parliamentary democracy and be a great leader in that situation. Washington would have been fine with that. But a triumvirate where he had to work with 2 people from other regions, that would never have worked for him. So neither Franklin or Washington ever got behind that idea. And if you had an idea that neither of them were behind, it was never going to pass. You needed at least one of them to back it. And you needed, in the end, when you came out of that secret convention, you needed the 2 of them to be aligned, because if they weren't aligned, this thing was not going to be ratified, because they were the 2 people that all Americans trusted.
One of the things to get onto their relationship, for the last little bit of the show here, I'm curious at the rate of their correspondence. And then the nature of it, like how much of it was like, let's figure this stuff out, and how much was like, I've got this great cat named Bob that can, play fetch and all that, like how much friendly conversation was in their thing. And then a third aspect of this, if you can get to it, what did you have to leave out of the book, but you just loved reading about in all of the research? Because there had to have been things you're like, this just doesn't fit, but boy, it's wonderful.
Well, to your first question, the nature of the correspondence, there was some of both. A lot of it was practical. Probably the most fruitful time of correspondence for our country was there were probably two. One was during the revolution after Franklin had been posted to France, because all these revolutionarily inspired noblemen and military leaders who were inspired by what was happening in America, particularly from France, but also from Poland and Germany and other places, wanted to go and serve on this noble adventure in America. So they all went to Paris, because Franklin was the chief diplomat in all of Europe. And they met with Franklin, and Franklin would vet them. And so Franklin would then send a letter with them to Washington if he thought they were good enough. And you think of all the great generals who came from von Steuben and Lafayette, they all came through Franklin. They all came through his letters of recommendation to Washington. So if that's a comparison to your saying, here's a great pet cat, he said, boy, this is a young guy, this Lafayette, but I think he can really help. And von Steuben can reorganize the troops. Some of the other Polish generals the same way. Now others insisted on going, and he'd send a very different letter. I mean, you could really tell that letter. And the letter was to Washington for them to carry. So we see those letters, but they would carry it. And some of these other letters were, well, this is an interesting person. He insists on going despite my recommendation that you already have too many officers. But he can give his own reference better than I can. And there are letters like this that Franklin was just, because he had a great sense of humor. He was America's first great humorist. And he was already very well-known humorist. And some of these letters are just hilarious. They're just the letters of recommendation you wouldn't want to have. So you do get that sort of letter, but you also get some very friendly letters. Franklin writes over to Washington, urging him, for example, when this war's over, please come over. He would go on vacation around in France, all over Europe. And of course, these vacations were sort of ways to get to know important people and get money for a revolutionary cause. And he said, I want to take you around. I want to host you. I want to take you to Italy. I want to show all these places. I mean, I want to travel with you. And Washington says, I'm just not a traveler. And I can't go. But you could see that sort of friendliness. And the other type of letter he'd write during this time was letters when he knew Washington was down after the defeats around New York. And he would send letters saying, the old generals over here in Paris, they're all reading about your exploits and they think you're doing a magnificent job. Clearly letters to boost his spirits and to increase his confidence. And then you get another big spurt of letters just before the Constitutional Convention, where Franklin is urging Washington to come to the Constitutional Convention, how important it is for you to come, how you're going to be greeted here as a hero. Those sort of letters, making sure that Washington, who has a lot of illnesses at this point, trying to draw him in and encourage him to come. So you get those letters, and then you get the trickle of various letters in between, where Washington urges Franklin, please come down and visit me at Mount Vernon. And Franklin says, I can't really travel anymore. My gout, that trip would be just too painful. And Washington says, well, I guess if we get together, it's going to have to come back. There are all those sorts of letters that get intermixed. And of course, some of these letters are critical for telling the story. Other letters, you can't put, if they're not critical to the narrative, they get dropped off into the footnotes. And it's so some of those letters and some of their individual actions that sort of get left behind. But one thing that's fun to do is Franklin, of course, is writing a newspaper at this time. And so you can follow that newspaper and you can see how he's plugging Washington and plugging the revolutionary cause in those articles. And so to be able to pull those out and enliven the story, you don't get the same sort of day-by-day narrative with Washington. All you really get with Washington is who's coming and going to Mount Vernon. And Franklin never makes it down there despite endless invitations. But so many of the other revolutionary leaders end up, if you follow the journal at Mount Vernon, end up spending key times there. In fact, James Madison, who gets so much credit for the Constitution, the month before the Constitutional Convention, he spends that entire month at Mount Vernon, obviously meeting with Washington all the time in designing what's going to happen. So Madison gets often described in textbooks as the architect of the Constitution. Well, the way I look at it, when you really follow what happens in Philadelphia and before, you say, yeah, Madison might be the architect of the Constitution, but George Washington was the general contractor. And anybody who sees the final product of a house knows that the general contractor has a lot more to do with how it finally looks than the architect.
Interesting. Any last questions, Eric?
Well, I guess maybe just to kind of wrap this, kind of bring it full circle, and maybe this is a tough question to wrap up, but that we're in a world now where everybody wants to tear something down or to rewrite the way we perceive. What's your answer to that? Because it seems to me that in reading this book, and it's specifically this book, because you had chapter by chapter, this is happening here, then this person's happening here. What's your advice for folks looking into this and really wanting to understand how we are so very different and so very much the same as the founding fathers were?
It's a great question, and I think really timely. People should consider this. As said earlier, it's tough if you make anybody an unadulterated hero, because you're going to find, just like all of us, we have our flaws, and you look at those flaws, and certainly one of the blind spots, despite the fact that it was pressed on him constantly, was Washington's handling of the slavery issue. I mean, Lafayette and Hamilton and Franklin and all these people who had better foresight on this issue, who saw the problem, pleaded with him to free his slaves when it might make a difference. And he ends up freeing him on his deathbed, which is certainly better than some of the others. Franklin, in contrast, comes full circle, and he becomes the founder of not the founder, but the president of the first abolitionist society. And he's an early advocate of abolition. Now, the result is, what do you focus on? And I think the important thing with all these people is to look at the whole person. Don't make him an adulterated hero. If we want to, just like nobody today, if you look back at us today, in a future, you're going to see a lot of things where, we're on the wrong side of history on. So we should look at these people in context and then not venerate them, but understand them. We can learn lessons of leadership. We can learn lessons of dignity. We can also learn cautionary tales from all these people. Now, Franklin holds up better than most. And indeed, even in this day, when dead white males don't do that well, Yale University just opened a new college a year or two ago, and they named it for Benjamin Franklin. Now, that says something. They weren't going to name one for George Washington at this stage. So you can look at these people, and I could understand, say, Princeton. If you're a student there, it's pretty tough to sit under a diverse student, sit under a picture glorifying Woodrow Wilson. If it's mindless glorification, yeah, that's a problem. But when I look at a statue, as a historian, I can contextualize it. And it tells us both about the person, but also about the time when that statue was put up. And if a statue makes, for good reason, they are public spaces and makes a person incredibly uncomfortable for good reason, as a statue of Andrew Jackson might, yeah, let's rethink it. But also, I think what it calls for is a better understanding of history, to contextualize these people and to realize they're both greatness and also, limitations in all these people. And maybe we can learn from both that person how we can be better people today, and also learn from the time that statue was put up, what does that tell us about that time period? And that's how I look at these things. And so while I can understand why some people might have difficulty, for example, to give an extreme example of that statue of Andrew Jackson across from the White House. On the other hand, bloody Andrew Jackson. And I can see why some people would be disquieted by it, but I can also see why, when I look at it, I says, well, isn't that ironic? Yeah, that's just what belongs in front of the White House, a bloody, Native American killer and Andrew Jackson up there. Now that tells us a lot. So if you're able to contextualize it, you can think of it in different ways. But I also can see why some in a public space, as opposed to a museum, without any contextualizing, might make me feel uncomfortable. I think it depends on what it is. A great example, Lincoln was an amazing president, and I'm all for the Lincoln Memorial, but then you get that statue of Lincoln in Lincoln Square in Washington, D.C., where they have that kneeling slave that he is holding down and freeing. And even Lincoln would have found that offensive, because Lincoln, once when a black person comes up to him and kneels before him, thanking him for emancipation, he says, "Don't kneel to me." And so, each statue, what it represents, how it be contextualized, I think that's how we have to take it, because we have to learn from these people. And there's an awful lot for us to learn from Franklin and Washington.
Yeah, when you go to the Jefferson Memorial, out there, it's a gorgeous walk, and you get there and you read the words and you look at the bronze man, and you are struggling to try to stomach it all. But then I always try to slow down and go, he's a man, I'm a man. I have made similar mistakes. There's compromises I've had to make that I did not want to make. And, you can start to, it doesn't justify slavery. Of course, slavery is terrible, but we have to have the context. And then another thing, and this is just me on my soapbox saying this, if you're claiming to be on the right side of history, that's folly, because we don't determine what our history is. That's down the road. Just try to be a good person. Try to find the good in all things and collaborate rather than destroy, is just my own personal thing.
I really appreciate the way you said that. And also think about that Jefferson Memorial. I'm glad you raised that, because if you read the words that are printed up there, such as a Declaration of Independence, the words that are chosen, those words are unadulteratedly good. Those words, the Declaration of Independence the parts written by Jefferson, have inspired Frederick Douglass, inspired the feminist leaders and the anti-suffragists. Susan B. Anthony, they used those words. Well, those are the words you read, not the words where he called, African Americans, inferior people, and those words. So as long as those words. See, Jefferson's another example. He said some words that transformed the world. And we don't want to forget those words, because those words are inspirational. And I just want to repeat, these people are mixed. And if we draw the best out of them, it helps make us better people.
Yeah, and I guess you could also give him credit for a lot of the constitutions and declarations of independence that followed these founders around the world. I mean, all over the world, it is a model that is still used. So you have to take this bad part and this good part. And also, by the way, and I'm no historian, I'm not trying to step on your credentials, but you read the words of Lincoln or anybody, Sherman, all these people, they are men of their time, and the understanding that they have and the things they write were their realities. We have the same problem here. We just can't see it because, again, you don't decide which side of history you're on. So if you want to get mad at Lincoln for his stance on slavery and African Americans, you could easily find text that would justify that. And you'd be completely short-sighted with the overall contribution he's had to history, world history, really.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And that's why you can be more critical of a person like Woodrow Wilson, because they were clearly on the backside. By the time Woodrow Wilson was fighting to enforce Jim Crow and add it to the military, people were already beyond it. And so you have people pulling us back and throwbacks. And when people are moving toward the abolition of slavery, you look at some of the Confederate generals who later lead the Ku Klux Klan, you realize, well, why should we? So you can take those people and you look in the context, and not everyone's has as much foresight as a Franklin. Washington didn't, for example, on slavery, but also with him, you can at least say he's a creature of his time when you get up to Wilson. And so you need to bring different evaluations to different people. And again, part of it is context. What can we learn from these people? Both lessons looking forward and backward. But your words, the way you describe it, you may say you're not a historian, but you're looking at it in, I think, a historical fashion.
Well, I appreciate it. Let me just make sure everybody understands Franklin and Washington, the founding partnership. It is a fantastic book. It's available on Amazon. You can see the link in the notes. I'll have a link in the show notes soon. Thank you so much, Ed, for coming on. I hope that you'll come back, and hopefully I can just pop up the road and meet you over at Pepperdine, because Malibu's pretty sweet. And thank you, Eric, for coming on. Anything in closing, Eric?
No, just an honor to be here, and it's an honor to talk to you, sir. I enjoyed your book very much, and Pete and I were having coffee, and I had mentioned that I was in the process of reading the book, and he says, I'm going to get that guy. So
well, thank you for so much for having me. I look forward to getting together with you for lunch here overlooking the water. And any other time you want me on this topic or a different topic, I'd love to see you again. So thank you so much. It's been an honor to be with you.
All right, everybody stand by. I'm going to sign off.